Social media has become a part of everyday life, whether that is a good or bad thing, with almost 4 billion users. Overall, there are many negative impacts that come from social media, which affect us in many ways. I will inform my audience about the negative impacts of social media, and at the end of my speech, everyone will be aware of all the negative effects social media has on us and the dangers and consequences we endure because of it. Through the main points of explaining the health problems social media creates, showing the studies that the negative impact of social media has on people. And third and lastly, I will explain the issue of high usage of social media, which leads to more problems. Social media has become very popular and a way of life for us, but it can also have negative things with it which affect us greatly. My first problem with this comes from the source Social Media and Mental Health by Hope Guide, which talks about how social media affects mental health, more specifically, the negative impact it has. This article discusses how things like posts, images, etc. play a key role on humans. They say the negative impact of social media on people begin to make them feel more insecure about themselves when they see posts, or can even give them a fear of missing out on things, which studies have shown for these two. Another thing the article discusses is how social media can also give people depression and anxiety by not giving face-to-face contact, which affects a person's mental health. These issues do not stop there, because it can also result in cyberbullying, with people commenting many hurtful things, rumors, and lies about people, which can also lead to mental health issues and suicides from there. Finally, this article brings up how self-absorption can occur as a result of social media, with all the selfies and personal things social media includes, which can lead to a lot of self-centeredness and make it harder to have real-life connections with other people and things. All of these can be hiding problems such as depression, anxiety, stress, loneliness, etc., since social media is often an escape/security blanket for these things, which affect mental health and gives it a negative impact on people. Not only does social media create health problems, but there are even many studies that show how it affects people. My next source is Teens and Social Media Use: What's the Impact, by the Mayo Clinic staff, which also discusses the negative impact of social media, but they use studies to show how it has that impact. The Mayo Clinic staff discusses how social media negatively affects sleep, depression, and anxiety by a study in 2016 showing that more than 450 teens have found the greater social media use they have, nighttime social media use, and emotional investment in social media, that such a feeling as upset when they prevented from logging off were even linked with worse sleep quality and higher levels of anxiety and depression. This helps to show another negative impact of social media, which will help people which will help make people more aware of how dangerous and consequential it can be. The article also discusses another study. This one is a 2019 study of more than 6,500 12 to 15-year-olds in the United States found that those who spend more than 3 hours a day using social media might be at a heightened risk for mental health problems. These staggering statistics not only show the negative impacts of social media, but they show they are reliable by using studies to back up their information and claims. These studies help show the negative impact social media has on people, but those health issues are not the only problems that come from social media. There are many more. Another issue brought up by my first source, which is Social Media and Mental Health by Help Guide, is that the amount of time people spend on social media can lead to isolation, which the University of Pennsylvania found in a study. This large amount of time on social media can also lead to an addiction to it, and it could be a sort of security blanket for people if they're stressed or have anxiety or are in uncomfortable situations. And we've all seen that when we go to dinners or something, or a family event where people become uncomfortable and they do that. My last source is Social Media: The Good, the Bad, the Ugly by Frances Dall'Omba. And she discusses all the bad and ugly things and statistics that occur from social media. She talks about increased usage of social media leads to many things such as addiction, cyberbullying, social anxiety, depression, and exposure to content that is not age appropriate for people. This addiction to social media can create self-image issues by needing others' approval on posts or by comparing yourself to others. This addiction / usage to social media does not stop there, but also creates problems within people. By bullying and cyberbullying has many effects on a person, such as it can make their mental health bad, they could become suicidal, a person may even want to harm themselves, and many other bad things. She shows some staggering statistics, such as 1 out of 4, 25% of teens are bullied, while up to 43% have been bullied while online. And 5.4 million children stay home on any given day because they fear being bullied. These all have negative impacts on people with social media, which can create fatal consequences. All of these points highlight the negative impact of social media and just how many things happen from it that we do not notice that causes billions of people to hurt themselves in many ways daily. With all of these points on the negative impacts of social media, from the health problems it creates to the many studies showing that social media has a negative impact on people, and even to the high usage of social media that people do not, that creates even more problems, it is easy to see that there is a downside to social media that affects and impacts people negatively, which is why we must always be aware of social media and be cautious while using it. Social media is going to become even bigger and become even more involved in our lives moving forward as technology gets better. So it is essential to know the negative impacts of social media so that we can be safe and not endure any of the consequences because of it, for the many reasons that I just showed through my main points. As people always say, be careful using social media and posting it because it is there forever and has lasting effects and consequences, whether they are good or bad.
Good job. Racism is defined as the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. People think racism is not as visible today, but in matter of fact, it is stronger than ever. In my speech, I will inform my audience about racism, and at the end of my speech, my audience will hopefully understand racism better. I will be informing my audience about racism by discussing what racism is, how it is still present in today's society, and what our role is when it comes to ending racism. Many people know the word racism, but don't know what the real definition is and how it affects different races. According to the Webster's Dictionary, racism is defined as the systematic oppression of a racial group to a social, economic, and political advantage of another. In other words, racism is treating another race like they are less than another. Racism affects different races differently and people differently. For example, for African Americans or Blacks, they are often stereotyped, and because of these stereotypes, people may act different around them. Racism isn't defined by a race or action or a place. It is universal. People often are quick to judge somebody based off of their skin color and race, which has created a stereotype for some races. Because of this stereotype, people may not want to hire certain races for certain jobs. People are treated differently and put into small or lower positions of work because the boss thinks they are capable of, which is so wrong because people should not be defined by the color of their skin or economic status. Every race faces racism, and there's not just one race that has to deal with it. Recently, there have been 3 main races that have been facing racism heavily. So, the Black Lives Matter movement was created in 2013, but in the years 2020 and 2021, it has really become known and everyone has heard of it. Black Lives Matter became more popular because of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Oh my God. On May 25th, George Floyd was killed under the knee of a white police officer while saying the words, "I can't breathe." Recently, there has been hate towards Asians due to the coronavirus, and people are creating violent acts towards them. But throughout all this, we don't have to stay silent. There are multiple ways we can stand up against racism. As a people, there are things we can do to stand up against racism, but most importantly, we need to come together as a people. Recently, people have been protesting, and the biggest protest recently was for Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was not just a protest, but a movement that was fully alive everywhere you went. Personally, I think the violence that occurred during the protest wasn't all necessary, but some of the actions were needed to be done in order for certain political leaders and people of power to recognize the problem and the reason for the protest. But along with protests, we can use our platforms in order for political leaders and people of power and people in general to understand what we are protesting about and to spread more knowledge and educate the youth on what we are fighting for. In the end, we are all a part of a movement, and it's our responsibility to stand up. Racism is everywhere we go, and everyone faces it at some point in their life, and even if they aren't fully aware that it is happening. Racism is unacceptable and will never and should never be okay. As a people, we need to come together to stand up against racism and racists. We cannot stay silent about this problem anymore, and we all need to realize that we're all connected by love.
Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less, is a coined phrase by Susan B. Anthony, who is an advocate for women's rights suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement was a long and exhausting period in order to achieve the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The purpose of this speech is to inform my audience of the women's suffrage movement, which includes an explained timeline and significant figures that played an important role. At the end of the speech, you will further understand what this women's suffrage movement was and who were part of making it all happen. But first, I would like to preview my main points. The women's suffrage movement took initiative a long time before major change came about. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were some of the few historical figures during this critical time period. And lastly, the women's suffrage movement ultimately led to the passing of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. Now I begin with my first main point, which is the women's suffrage movement took initiative a long time before major change came about. Some people believe that the women's suffrage movement began in 1848, but I believe it took place well before this time with Abigail Smith Adams. Mrs. Adams was the wife of John Adams, the founding father of the Declaration of Independence. According to an article posted by Deborah Michaels, Abigail Adams was not a very outspoken activist, but she always asked her husband to remember the ladies when it came to writing new laws. Abigail Adams made it her life's mission to provide more protection for women under new laws, but also provide education for women. Abigail Adams was one of the first advocates for women's rights, which took place in 1776, well before any major change came about. But it was definitely a start. Although many historians do not take Abigail's advocacy into account, it was definitely a starting point because for a fight that would last for many decades. This leads to my second main point, which talks about some of the most important historical figures of the women's suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were some of the few historical figures of this critical time period. In 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. This was one of the first organizations built to advocate for women's rights. This organization was built alongside the American Women's Association, which supported the passing of the 15th Amendment. But in contrast, Susan B. Anthony did not agree with the 15th Amendment because it did not extend the right to vote to women as well. So she and Stanton formed the NWSA to advocate for laws extending rights for women to vote. This did not mean that Susan B. Anthony despised the 15th Amendment, but she believed that women too should also have the right to vote. So she formed NWSA to advocate for women's rights, so herself and millions of others could have the right to vote. After years of advocating and pushing for women's rights, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were able to see the results of the work, but from heaven for sure, because both women died before any major change came about. This leads to my final and most important point. The women's suffrage movement ultimately led to the passing of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. After struggling and suffering, Congress introduced the Women's Suffrage Amendment in 1878. This was a major step towards ending the inequality in America and forming a more perfect union. The amendment was shot down in Congress plenty of times until 1893, when Colorado was the first state to ratify an amendment granting women the right to vote. The battle for women's rights to vote carried on for another decade and ultimately led to the passing of the 19th Amendment. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, which gave the women the right to vote. It was a long and rocky road that led up to this major change, but women were finally granted the right to vote. It may seem insignificant at times, but it was a step closer for equality for women here in the United States. And it is important to stick and persevere through times like this, because at the end of the day, it's worth it. Now I draw to my conclusion. Today, I have informed you about what the women's suffrage movement was and the key figures that made it all happen. I spoke about when the movement first started and how it was carried on for many decades. We learned about the historical key figures such as Abigail Adams, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who all played a major role in this major event. Lastly, we learned when the 19th Amendment was ratified and the long process it took to achieve that ratification. If you take anything from this speech today, I want you to remember that change is not always easy, but you have to stick to it, because at the end of the day, the good things are worth fighting for. Just like all the women and advocates stuck with their mission until change was made. Thank you.